My name is Pallavi, and I'm going to be talking about my version of the top 10 people or events in psychology. So, starting off with Sigmund Freud. We all know Sigmund Freud. You guys know him because he's either very controversial with some of his theories, but in the end, a lot of people do know him. And honestly, that's enough to earn him the top of the spot at the list. And his main work was centered around the psychoanalytic theory and how our unconscious desires frame the way we behave and think. However, a lot of other psychologists at the time who disagreed with him, called the Neo-Freudians, said that he overemphasized sex and was considered, sexist at that time because he characterized and explained something as complex as the human mind with just sex. So at the end of the day, he's still considered the father of modern psychology because of how well he was able to make connections between the unconscious and conscious mind back in the 1900s. However, it was only a century later till we learned that his foundations might be a little rusty. Alright, and number 2, we have the Phineas Gage case study. Gage suffered a severe brain injury from an iron rod penetrating his skull, which he miraculously survived. And after the accident, Gage's personality was said to have changed as a result of the damage to his frontal lobe, because the frontal lobe is the seat of a bunch of neural networks that determine our personality and help us in day-to-day tasks such as problem solving, spontaneity, memory, language. The list goes on and on. But Gage's case study is super famous because it shows the resilience of the human brain and illustrates how certain areas of the brain have different functions and contribute to our personality. So next we have the Stanford prison experiment. I personally thought this was a very cool experiment to learn about. And this was basically a social psychology experiment, which was included very highly educated students from Stanford, and they were told to play like almost a real life game of cops and robbers. Well, not really robbers, but prisoners. So this experiment was executed by Philip Zimbardo, but it had to be terminated after 6 days because of the drastic, psychological effects the inmates and the police went through. So basically, the police were directed and given police duties that they should fulfill, and those that stepped out of line, the inmates, they would be punished. And this spiraled completely out of control because the guards became cruel and tyrannical, and the prisoners began to spiral out of control, and it, had major psychological effects on them, and they just couldn't handle it anymore. So basically, the point of this experiment mainly centered around how roles can define a person's behavior and have an influence on their output towards others and themselves, essentially. So number 4, we have Ivan Pavlov's conditioning experiments. So to keep it simple, the most important takeaway from the conditioning experiments were that it involved pairing a behavior and a consequence, also known as reinforcements and punishments. And basically, he concluded that, learning can occur when a conditioned stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus. So Pavlov said that if a particular stimulus in the dog's surroundings was present when the dog was given that food, then that stimulus could become associated with food and cause salivation on its own. So here you have that bell example. So the dog is noticing, when the bell rings, that means I must have food there. So next time when the food itself isn't there and the bell just rings, the dog will still salivate. And that's your, conditioned response. So number 5, we have the nurture versus nature twins experiment, or just, nurture versus nature, looking at the difference between those two and how it affects twins. So it's just a debate that involves the extent to which particular aspects of behavior are a product of either inherited or acquired influences. And behavioral genetics is a huge field of psychology, and it's enabled to quantify the relative contribution of nature versus nurture with regard to specific psychological traits. So this is also including epigenetics. So, beyond going, just looking at your DNA, how does your environment affect who you are, how you are. So, instead of defending extreme nativist or nurturist views, most psychological researchers are now interested in investigating how nature and nurture interact in a host of qualitatively different ways. So number 6, we have the Little Albert experiment. So the Little Albert experiment demonstrated that classical conditioning could be used to create a phobia or fear. So, a phobia is an irrational fear that is out of proportion to the danger. And in this experiment, a previously unafraid baby, which is little Albert, was conditioned to become afraid of a rat. So, this experiment is obviously very, very, could be considered extremely unethical, because it's like, why would you make a baby cry? But, you know, the purpose of this experiment was to assess whether classical conditioning processes can be shown in humans, which is the, association of the stimulus or behavior with an unrelated one after repeated exposure. So what happens in this diagram, this little diagram, it's kind of neat here. So there's a rat, the baby's not afraid. However, from a loud noise, the baby is afraid. So when you put those two together, when you put the loud noise and the rat together, the baby cries. So what happens is the baby thinks every time that there's a loud noise that there will be the rat. So all of a sudden, back then when the baby was not afraid of the rat, it suddenly is now, because it's associating that loud noise with that rat now. So it's very interesting to see how they tested it, and here's a actual picture of it. So yeah. And so number 7, I put Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. So this experiment demonstrated that children are able to learn social behavior such as aggression through the process of observational learning. So like watching another person, basically. And this the findings of Albert Bandura ultimately contributed to the social learning theory. So basically, in the groundbreaking study on aggression led by Albert Bandura, demonstrated that children are able to learn through the observation of adult behavior. So Albert Bandura's social learning theory suggests that observation and model playing are a primary role in how and why people learn. And it goes beyond the perception of learning being the result of direct experience with the environment. So, some of these kids who have aggressive parents or have parents who are always fighting have, shown aggression towards the Bobo doll. And those who have maybe loving parents, a stable home, happy home, they tend to, be a little more gentle with the Bobo doll. And honestly, I think that's pretty relatable to these days, society these days. There's a lot of RPG games with guns, violence, and honestly, it says a lot about how the person is in person, their demeanor. They're more agitated, I believe, games that are extremely violent. I think it can definitely take a toll, especially if the kid is, spending hours and hours on the game. It definitely shows, what kind of person they become, because they're just, learning. It's almost like modeling, almost. So yeah, that's number 7. And there we go. Number 8. So Ash's conformity study. The experiment revealed that the degree to which a person's own opinion are influenced by those of a group. So basically, a scientist named Solomon Asch put a bunch of people called stooges and then one person, his experimenter, and he showed them this picture of lines. And basically he showed them this target line right here. And then he showed them these lines and was like, okay, pick the line you think that is the closest, size and relative height to the target line. And obviously, looking from this picture, we can say that it's either C. C looks about right here. So, as obvious as it is in here, one of the stooges here were, instructed to clearly say B. And this confused the experimenter, the subject, and Solomon Asch wanted to study that. He was like, how much did it take for a person to change their opinion, even when they knew they were so surely right? So this experiment was concluded that people conform for 2 main reasons. They want to fit in with the group, or, that's the term for that is called normative influence, or because they believe the group is more informed than they are, which is called informational influence. So this experiment shows the extraordinary lengths people will go to just to, match the others and conform with other people's behavior. So, yep. And number 9, we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So this is a theory of motivation which states that, 5 categories of human needs dictate an individual's behavior, and those needs are psychological needs, safety needs, love and belonging needs, esteem needs, and self-actualization needs. And the goal is to attain the level or stage of self-actualization, really knowing who you are by establishing all these needs and, making yourself sufficient with, enough of each level will let you know who you are as a person. And he suggests that this hierarchy of needs, when levels are unmet, it can explain differences in behavior patterns. So while doing research, Maslow noticed that some needs took precedence over others. So, for example, if you're hungry and thirsty, most people deal with thirst first because it's a stronger need than hunger. So it's like these little tweaks that he examined, and he's like, oh, this is how people are different from each other. This is how people's hierarchy of needs are different from each other, hence why they behave differently. So, number 10, here we go. Intelligence scale development. Okay. So, this is my last one. Not to say that's the least important, just out of this list, I thought it was important to add because it is a very big thing within psychology. There's a lot of tests to measure that can measure, aptitude, your skill set, and your IQ. There's so many different tests. So defining and classifying intelligence is extremely complicated, and theories of intelligence range from one general intelligence to certain primary mental abilities and to multiple category-specific intelligences. So following, the creation of the Binet-Simon scale in the early 1900s, intelligence tests, now referred to as the intelligence quotient or IQ tests, are the most widely known and used for determining an individual's intelligence. So, although these tests are generally reliable and valid tools, they do have their flaws as they lack cultural specificity and can evoke stereotypical threats and self-fulfilling prophecies. So IQ scores are typically normally distributed on the bell curve, meaning that 95% of the population has IQ scores between 70 and 30. However, there are more extreme examples of people whose scores will exceed beyond 130 or far below 70. So, yep, that is my top 10 for psychology. I really hope people who are taking this course next year really get to enjoy these case studies and these experiments, because it really is interesting once you do take a look and you see what they did back in the 1900s, almost like a whole century ago. So, yep, that is it.